Welcome to Reddit Sleep, where we listen, we relax. I'm your host, Reddit Sleep. Tonight we have another special episode. This time we are going to start out with an episode titled My Artificial Heart. To really help set the mood, we are going to play the sound of rain on the background. So now, let's relax and enjoy the story. My Artificial Heart. We'd gone to a concert that night. Elton John. He was Charlotte's favorite singer, and the tickets had been expensive, but I knew that it would have meant the world to Charlotte. She didn't know until we were at the venue. She knew that this was date night and we were going to a concert, but she didn't know who we were seeing. I took her to a nice restaurant on the way into Toronto, the one that did their steak just the way she liked it. I remember the way she smiled at me, even after 5 years of marriage. Seeing that smile had never gotten old. It was a shy, sweet half-smile, the kind that slowly crept across her face like a growing warmth. From the day I'd met her, I'd been in love with her smile, and as we drove to the concert, she was still smiling. "Who did you say was playing again?" she asked me. "I can't remember," I lied, and my terrible poker face finally broke after months of secrecy. "You know what? Check my phone. I've got the tickets on there." She paused, seeing the grin on my face. She must have known something was up. From the corner of my eye, I watched her unlock my phone. Then I saw her mouth drop open. I saw her eyes widen as she realized what I'd done. "Tom, you didn't what?" I asked, laughing at her excited bewilderment. "Elton? Seriously? How did you? How much? Don't worry about it," I promised her. "I've been saving up for this for a while." I looked over at her, still smiling. "It's the last chance we'll get to see him. I heard he's retiring after this tour, so why not take the chance? Say we saw him at least once." I could see the tears filling Charlotte's eyes, and knowing that I'd made her so happy all she could do was cry filled me with a deep satisfaction. If I hadn't been driving, she would have pulled me into a hug, pressing her lips against mine. No, the hugging and kissing would have to wait. "Oh my God, Tom!" she sniffled, looking at the tickets on my phone. "Thank you so much, honey. Thank you." She wiped her eyes, still smiling at the tickets on her phone. "I love you so much. I love you too, baby." The concert was nothing short of magical. Even in his old age, Elton John had lost none of his charm. He went through his classics and even played some of my favorites. I'd spent the extra money to get us good seats, and I was thankful for that. As we danced during the show, Charlotte stayed close to me. I could see the lights from the stage reflected in her eyes, and despite the crowd, it felt like we were alone. Just us, Elton, and the band. There couldn't be a more perfect night. As Elton John sang through the final harmonies of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, I held her close and I felt her arms around me in turn. I held her hand as we left the auditorium, squeezing out amongst the rest of the crowd. The concert felt so fresh and vibrant in my mind, and in that moment, I'd never been happier. Right there, that time, that place. That was where I belonged. That was where I wanted to be. I wanted to pause that moment and hold on to it forever. I wanted to stay a young couple on their way home from an Elton John concert, madly in love and content with their place in the world. I suppose in a sense I did. We'd just gotten to the underground parking lot where I'd left my car. We were still high off the atmosphere of the concert, and I hadn't yet come down. I didn't think anything of the man walking towards us. There was nothing shady about him, not obviously so. He was tall and young with dark brown hair and stubble. He wore a leather jacket and had his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem to be paying us any attention at all, and so I saw no need to pay any attention to him. He drew nearer to us, and I expected him to pass us by with no issue. But then I saw the gun in his hand. "Hold it." His voice was stern, gruff, and commanding. An abrupt gasp escaped Charlotte as the man stared at her. She hugged my body tighter. "No sudden movements or I'll shoot." The man warned, "Wallets, phones, and jewelry. Hand them over. Now." I'd barely even processed what he said before he'd repeated himself. "Wallets, phones, and jewelry. Right fucking now, jackass." He snarled, "Slowly. Move it." Okay. No need to be hasty," I said, my voice slow and anxious. I didn't want to spook him. I didn't want this to go south. The sudden mugging still had me a little shell-shocked, but I had no reason to suspect this man wasn't going to kill us. The fear hadn't kicked in just yet, nor had the thought of defending myself. I reached into my pocket, slowly and methodically. The mugger watched me before aiming the gun at me. I said slowly, "Fucker." I opened my mouth to speak when I heard the gun go off. I felt a sudden pain in my chest, like I'd been punched. The next thing I knew, I was falling and Charlotte was screaming. Then came the second gunshot, and then nothing. I don't remember the next few days. If I focus, I can recall snippets. The beep of hospital machinery. I can remember the calming voices of nurses and fever dreams. I imagine they kept me pretty doped up, but part of it had to do with the hospital itself. When one is in the hospital, days and hours blend together into one indecipherable mess. You struggle to pick out individual days or conversations. You drift between sleeping and insomnia. The machines, light, and constant checkups make it impossible to sleep until you can't keep your eyes open anymore. Then you drift in and out of sleep over and over again, never sure if you're dreaming or not. My first clear memory was sitting in my hospital bed. I was weak and sleepy. My body had a dull ache around it, and I remember a man sitting by my bed. He had a graying beard and kind eyes, like a dog's eyes, big and droopy and soft. He had a gentle, placid smile. I didn't remember him entering the room. There was a vague familiarity to him, although I couldn't seem to remember where we'd met. My memories felt all jumbled and hazy. Most prominently, there was the finality of the gunshot, Charlotte's screams of terror, and a blinding white light. "Hello, Tom." He had a soft, calm voice. "Hello." My mouth was dry. My voice sounded dull and scratchy. "I'm Dr. David Young." He said, "I've been monitoring your case. How are we feeling today? Tired?" I murmured, "Where's Charlotte?" "Tired." "Well, that's to be expected." Dr. Young said, "Tom, do you remember the operation?" "Operation?" I didn't remember anything about an operation. "No." "Where's Charlotte?" "I want to see my wife." He looked me dead in the eye, ever smiling and unblinking before he continued to speak. "That's good. Do you remember why you're here, Tom?" Dr. Young asked. Slowly, I nodded. Yeah, there was a guy. He wanted my wallet. He shot me." "Yes, he did." Dr. Young said, "He did a lot of damage too. You're very lucky to be alive. We did what we could, but we couldn't save your heart. We were forced to act fast." "My heart? What was he talking about?" What? "My heart feels fine. What about Charlotte?" Dr. Young paused for a moment. His placid smile softened only slightly. "Tom, I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Charlotte suffered severe injuries during the attack. She didn't make it to the hospital. You almost didn't either. Your heart was very heavily damaged. We were forced to use an artificial replacement." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. The doctor just continued to smile plainly at me, like nothing was wrong. What? Charlotte, she can't be. I feel fine. Where's Charlotte? I have to see her. I tried to sit up, but an overwhelming pain flooded through my body. A scream escaped me and I collapsed back down onto the bed. Dr. Young stood over me, hands on my shoulders. Now, Don't strain yourself, Tom, he warned. You're still very weak. I'm so sorry about Charlotte, but there was nothing we could do. She'd lost too much blood, and we couldn't find a compatible donor in time. She was AB. You were A. I'm truly very sorry. I stared into his eyes, and in my haze I realized what he was telling me.
No.
No, 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 no. The tears started to run down my cheeks as the truth dawned on me. My Charlotte was gone. In time, Dr. Young gave me the details. The mugger had shot me in the chest, but he had shot Charlotte in the neck. She'd bled out before anyone could save her. Her funeral was closed casket. It seemed almost appropriate that the mugger had also deprived me of my heart. Dr. Young told me that they'd been unable to find a donor in such a short time span. It had been either the artificial heart or letting me die. I still wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice or not. The police came. They asked for details, but what little I was able to provide didn't net them anything. Whoever had killed my Charlotte, whoever had stolen my heart, they were long gone. It was while I was still in the hospital that I started my first novel. Sleep was impossible, even though I was dead tired. Every time I tried, I'd dream of a white light and faint voices that went silent when I heard Charlotte begin to scream in terror and anguish. It was the most horrible scream I'd ever heard, the final sound she made on this earth. Writing was the only thing I could think to do to cope. It wasn't the pain that spurred me on. It was the loss. Maybe that was why people liked it. I wrote about Charlotte, of course. I wrote about how much I loved her, and into those pages I poured all the things I'd never been able to say to her, all the love I'd never been able to give her. It was my brother who convinced me to publish. He told me it would help me heal, that it would be like an exorcism. Publishing didn't change a thing, although my first novel had sold surprisingly well on Amazon. I was hardly a celebrity, but people seemed to like what I was doing. I'd met my agent soon afterwards. 2 years after I'd lost my Charlotte, I was still living in the same empty house where I resented the vacant space where she'd once been. Every night, I dreamed of an underground parking lot and a man in a leather jacket. I dreamed of bright white hospital lights and Charlotte staring at me from a table beside me. I dreamed of her pained screams as she died. Most nights I'd wake up in a cold sweat, crying and feeling ready to start screaming myself. I could feel that piece of plastic in my chest racing like a real heart. Then I'd get out of bed and check my emails. Usually it would be spam. Sometimes it would be work-related, and every now and then I'd get an update on my place on the waiting list for a healthy organic heart. Dr. Young made it clear that the artificial pump that now existed within me was a temporary measure. But after 2 years, I wasn't so sure anymore. Would they just leave it in me? The longest a patient had ever survived with a heart like that was 4 years. Would I go for even longer? I wasn't sure. After I was done with my emails, I'd open up my latest WIP and start to write. I'd immerse myself in the world of Florence Ross. Florence was a beautiful woman with a sweet half smile that spread warmly across her face. She was a former police officer who'd left the force after an accident and had started her own private detective agency. She wasn't Charlotte. I suppose I gave her some of the same features, but in many ways she became her own person. Charlotte had always been quiet and a little shy. I couldn't remember her raising her voice since I'd met her. Florence was brave. She was tough and willing to do anything for those she loved. She was a beautiful redhead with jade green eyes, a far cry from Charlotte's pale blonde. I suppose I loved Florence in my own way. She was my creation and my coping mechanism. If I could not love Charlotte, I'd love Florence instead. It seemed like such a simple solution. Florence's third adventure was called City of Rats and detailed her investigation into the disappearance of a missing child. It was a tale of deception lies. I was quite proud of it, in fact. It was my first release that would be coming out in print on the same day it came out online. The day of the launch, my agent had convinced me to do a book signing. It wasn't something I normally did, but I figured it would be worth a shot. He set me up in a local bookstore at a desk with several copies of City of Rats and its two predecessors, Island of Lies and Cavern of Fear. If I'd been expecting lines out the door, I would have been disappointed. There were 3 women from out of town who were fans, but aside from them, no one else really came. I found myself sitting at the table, absent-mindedly thumbing through the pages of my own novel. "Excuse me, are you Tom Harrison?" The voice caught me off guard, and I looked up to see a woman approaching me. She had long, flowing red hair and freckles dotted across her cheeks. She wore a turtleneck and a black jacket. "Yes, I am. Pleased to meet you." I made myself perk up a little, although I honestly didn't want to bother with the book signing anymore. The woman stared at the copies of my books on the table, brow furrowed. "So, you wrote the Florence Ross books, huh?" she asked. "Yeah, that was me," I replied with a sheepish smile. "You ever read any of them?" "I discovered them last week, actually. They were good. I don't usually read a lot. I don't have the patience for it, but these ones were, well, I guess you could say they were special." She picked up a copy of Island of Lies and stared at the cover. Looking at her, I got to thinking that this woman looked a lot like how I'd imagined Florence would look. "I'm glad I could keep your interest," I said. She continued to stare at the cover. The stories were all right, but that's not why I was interested. She said, "You got some of the details wrong, by the way. I never actually met the smugglers who were in the cave. I just saw their setup and called the police. It was a lot smaller than you described, too." "Excuse me?" The woman set the book back down. "You don't know me?" she asked. "I don't think we've ever met." I replied, "I'm sorry. Is there something I'm forgetting? Or, I guess it would be easier if I showed you," she said, reaching into her purse. For a moment, I half expected her to pull out a gun, but instead she reached for her wallet. "My name is Florence Ross. You can check my ID if you'd like." She offered me her open wallet, and I took it reluctantly. "Okay, very funny," I said. She didn't smile. "Open it. See for yourself." I frowned, but I opened her wallet. Sure enough, I could see a driver's license with her picture on it. It was set to expire in 2 years, and the name on it read, Florence Emily Ross. A jolt of shock raced through me before I understood what this was. Then I started to laugh. "Well, that's one hell of a coincidence," I said as I handed her wallet back. "You know, that's what I thought at first. I wondered if you'd read about the island story in the newspaper or something. I didn't think it was ever published, but I wanted to look into it." Wait. You don't actually expect me to believe you're Florence from my books, right?" I asked. "Truth be told, I'm not even sure what I believe," Florence admitted. "The details weren't all the same, but, well, look at what was. Guess that's why I came looking for you." "So what? You can figure out if I'm writing my series about you?" I asked. "Well, it's a bit of an odd coincidence, Miss Ross, but I assure you, I wasn't trying to copy your life." Florence nodded thoughtfully, her hands in her pockets. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Well, can't blame me for being curious, though." She opened her wallet again, taking out a 20. "Sorry to hold you up. Mind if I get a signed copy? For research purposes. From what I heard, the story to this one sounds pretty familiar." "Sure." I opened one of the City of Rats books and signed it for her, to Florence from Tom. Florence pocketed the book. "Thanks. Hey, if you don't mind me asking, how much longer will you be here?" "I'm finishing up in an hour," I said. Good. Tell you what, I'm gonna grab a coffee in that shop across the street. If you don't mind, I'd like to pick your brain on a few things. I wasn't sure if she was asking me or telling me I was going to meet her there. All I could say was, "Sure, I suppose." "Good." Florence gave me a nod. "Well then, I'll be waiting. Thanks for the signing, Mr. Harrison." With that, she left to head to the coffee shop. She moved like a bullet, straight to her destination.
No distractions.
She moved the way I'd envisioned my Florence to move. When I got to the coffee shop, Florence was waiting for me. I knew that the coffee in front of her was black. She'd gotten me a soda as well. Interesting. She watched me from the corner of her eye as I drew nearer to her. "I appreciate the drink," I said as I sat down. "I had a feeling you'd be thirsty," she said. "Sorry if you wanted a coffee." "No, soda's perfect. I don't really like hot drinks," I replied. "So, you said you wanted to pick my brain, right?" "Yeah, I did," she said. "I guess I'm just trying to understand where exactly the similarities are coming from. I mean, I know this isn't some stranger-than-fiction type of bullshit. I know who I am. I'm me, and like I said, the books don't get everything right. It's weird." Finished. Florence nodded. "It's very weird. I guess it's just curiosity that's keeping me here right now. I want to know where this came from." "Well, there's not much of a story to it," I said. Florence was somewhat based off my wife, Charlotte. I changed her appearance a bit. I'll be honest, I drew some inspiration from Florence Welch. She was one of Charlotte's favorite singers. Her and Elton John. Music always meant so much to her. Plus, she seemed like a good fit. I'm not too familiar with her music. I think I might have heard of her, though. Florence said, "What about the history? Where did that come from? The whole injured cop thing?" "I can't say for sure," I admitted. "Kinda came out of a dream I had. I had a few dreams about detective scenes and all that. They were around the time I thought up the character, actually. I think the first one laid the groundwork for the boat ride to the island." Florence listened in silence, nodding her head as I spoke. "What about the name?" she asked. "Well, first name is obvious. Florence Welch again. Then I just thought Ross might sound nice behind it. My explanations didn't seem to calm her any. Not in any visible way, at least. She remained mostly stoic. "I see." Her tone was thoughtful, and she took a long sip of her coffee. "Interesting. I suppose you were a cop before all this," I said. Florence nodded and set her coffee down. "Yeah. I did all right for myself. I was a detective. I'm gonna guess you want to know why I quit." "Huh. I did. In my story, Florence had been taken off the force after a car accident while pursuing a murderer. It was only after the murderer had gone free that she'd become a private eye. It's not as interesting as it was in your story. I had a health condition. It was something I'd always had since I was a kid. I knew the risks when I joined the force, but I thought it would be worth it. I figured I'd be fine. Then a couple of years ago, my symptoms got worse and I ended up in the hospital. It was bad. Surgery and everything. After that, it was either stay behind a desk for the rest of my career or find something else. Paperwork just wasn't for me. I became a cop because I wanted to help people, and I guess I only felt like I could do that on the street. I figured PI work would suit me. I could still help people, and maybe it wouldn't be as many hours. It didn't quite work out the way I wanted it to. "Still married to your job, huh?" "I guess you could say that." Florence took another sip of her coffee, emptying it. She sighed. "I don't know what the fuck I was expecting, looking for you like this. Christ, I've wasted both of our time. Hey, if I was in your shoes, I'd have had a few questions too," I said. I managed to crack a sheepish smile. Florence scoffed, but she didn't leave. "Why don't I get you a fresh coffee?" I asked. "Black, right? A tiny, familiar smile crossed her lips. Yeah, black. I didn't intend to spend so much of that evening talking to Florence in that coffee shop, but our conversation soon shifted away from my writing and towards our lives. I told her about Charlotte, and she told me about her life before the accident. Her life story wasn't exactly the same as my Florence's. There were many, many differences, and I didn't bring up the similarities. Truthfully, I didn't care. The real woman in front of me was so much more interesting than the character I'd made up. We talked until the coffee shop kicked us out, and as we walked to our cars, I asked her one final question. "Hey, Florence." She looked back at me, but didn't speak. Silence wasn't a bad thing from her. She just didn't always feel the need for words. That was fine. If you have any more questions, I can leave you my number, if you want. That smile was so much like Charlotte's, but on her it seemed even sweeter. Felt like I'd earned something. "Yeah, I think I'd like that," she said, turning to approach me. We swapped numbers before we went our separate ways, and I hadn't felt so giddy in years. Questions over coffee turned into conversation over dinner. A conversation over dinner turned into tickets to a play. Tickets to a play turned into Florence coming into my empty home to watch a movie with me, and that movie lasted all night. It was a shame we never got around to finishing it. We weren't even around the 10-minute mark before we were necking on the sofa like a couple of teenagers. I felt her hands tugging at my shirt, and I let her take it off of me and toss it aside. I saw her eyes fixate on my chest, and her fingers traced the scar over my heart. "It doesn't hurt," I assured her. Her eyes met mine, and she chuckled. I'd never heard her laugh like that before. "I know," she replied. She reached down, pulling off her own shirt. My attention was only briefly on her lacy black bra. What was between her breasts was of greater interest to me. A faded line just like the one on my chest. A scar from heart surgery. This is why I had to give up my badge.
I'm lucky he survived.
They found a donor heart just in time. I reached out, almost touching her scar, but hesitating. She took my wrist and pressed my fingers against the healed wound. I could feel her heart fluttering beneath it. "It's all right." Her voice was soft, breathy almost. "Like you said, it doesn't hurt." She leaned in closer to me and our lips met. Her arms encircled me, holding me close. Her body was so warm against mine, and I realized that I'd forgotten what that sudden rush of lust felt like. It was nice to remember. She was different than Charlotte had been. Rougher and more demanding, but that wasn't a bad thing. As we lay together in the afterglow of what we'd done, I almost felt like crying. In the bedroom light, I could see Florence's head on the pillow beside me. She was smiling that sweet little smile, and for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like everything was going to be all right. I dreamed of pale hospital lights. They were blinding over my head. The horrible rhythmic beep of a heart monitor made me want to squirm, but I couldn't move. "Tom!" I looked over, and I could see Charlotte beside me. She was laying on a bed beside me. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and there was a horrible yet familiar fear in her voice. I could see tubes coming out of her arms, and I watched as a figure appeared beside her, towering over her. "This one first. She's in better health," said a voice. "Scalpel, please." A blue-gloved hand reached down towards Charlotte and opened her dress, exposing her breasts. "No, please no."
No, no.
Another hand reached down, holding a scalpel and its cold steel pressed into her skin as Charlotte let out one final, horrified final scream.
No.
I woke up thrashing, fighting to get free of the covers. I was panting heavily. When I felt hands on my shoulder, I flinched. "Tom!" Florence's voice sounded so distant and foreign to me. "Tom, it's okay. I'm here. It's okay." I looked over at her, and I must have looked like a wild-eyed madman. But Florence didn't recoil. "What's wrong?" she asked. She rubbed my back with a slow, circular motion. My breathing was slowing down. "I'm fine," I murmured. "Just bad dream." "Charlotte?" Florence asked. I nodded.
Yeah.
"We were in the hospital." I trailed off, not wanting to tell her any more. She didn't push for it.
I'm sorry.
"I understand if it's painful. It's not your fault," I said, looking back at her. I forced a smile. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I'm glad you're here, though." Florence studied me for a few moments before leaning in for a quick but gentle kiss. "Happy to help," she said before glancing at the clock. It was 5 in the morning, and she collapsed back down onto my bed. In the low light, I admired the moonlight through the window on her body. "Well, I guess if nothing else, you're a half-decent alarm clock." "Why's that?" I asked, laying back down with her. "I've got an appointment with my cardiologist at 7. It's just a check-in, so I suppose I could have one more hour." She sighed and drummed her fingers down on the duvet, as if thinking it over. "Which hospital are you going to?" I asked. "McMaster. I suppose I could wait a bit. It's only about a 30-minute drive." "McMaster? You wouldn't happen to know Dr. Young, would you?" I asked. Florence looked up at me. "That's who I'm seeing today, actually. He's the one who treated me when my heart started failing."
Nosleep?
"Me too," I said. Florence just laughed. "Christ, any more shit like this, and I might start thinking you're following me," she said between chuckles. "I'm not entirely convinced I'm not," I replied, mostly joking. "Well, stalker boy, wake me in half an hour or so. Then I might need you to show me how to use your shower." Florence rolled over and pulled my duvet over her. I let my gaze linger on her for a few moments, smiling absently before laying back down beside her. I spotted my phone on my bedside table and reached out to grab it. Florence had her back to me, so I figured the light wouldn't bother her at all. I checked the date of my next appointment with Dr. Young. Still a month away. Nothing to worry about at the moment. I felt fine, although something was weighing in the back of my mind. I remembered the dream that had woken me up. I knew I'd had that dream before, but I hadn't thought much about it before. I took a look on the hospital website and looked up Dr. David Young. There wasn't a lot to see on the hospital website. Just Dr. Young in his lab coat, posing for a staff photo. They had his phone number, his email, and a short bio, but not much else. After a moment's thought, I figured I'd look him up on Facebook. No harm in that, right? Sure, it probably wasn't entirely normal to look up one's doctor, but some nagging feeling in the back of my mind told me that I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep until I'd done it. There were plenty of accounts listed for David Young, and I didn't have any intention of scrolling through them all, but I figured I'd at least skin the first 5. No, make that 10. That was a fair amount, right? Dr. Young was the 7th result, and I clicked on his profile to take a look at it. There wasn't much to see. He didn't seem to have many friends, and I caught myself scrolling through his pictures. In most of them, he was at a cottage. I could see various people who I assumed were his family members in them, and I was about to click out when I scrolled onto an image of Dr. Young beside a man in a leather jacket. He was smiling, although the man beside him wasn't. He wore a neutral expression that said he didn't want to be photographed. I stared at the other man for a few moments, focusing intently on him, and my eyes widened as I realized where I recognized him from. "No sudden movements or I'll shoot." The words came back to me like fragments of a bad dream. I remembered the gunshot and the haze. I looked into the face of the man who'd taken my heart and murdered my Charlotte, and I looked at the smile on Dr. Young's face. "Spending my 40th with my favorite nephew," said the caption. It was tagged with the name Jimmy Young. I clicked on the name. Access to that profile was restricted, but the image was one of Jimmy Young smoking a cigarette and sitting on some stairs. Wallets, phones, and jewelry right fucking now, jackass. What was this? What the fuck was this? I thought about telling Florence when she woke up. Maybe I should have, but I had no idea what to say. I had no idea how to explain any of this. When she woke up, I pretended to be asleep, and I let her have the run of the place. I heard her showering in the next room, and then dressing herself. I felt her presence over me as she leaned down to kiss the side of my head. I stirred to let her know I was awake. "I'll text you later," she promised, although her sultry tone was wasted on me. My mind was elsewhere. I lay in bed for most of the morning, and I had a feeling there was only one way I'd ever get any answers. I drove over to the hospital as soon as I was dressed. I left barely 10 minutes after Florence did. My intention wasn't to follow her, but something weighed on my mind. I'm not sure what pushed me. All I knew is that there was something else going on. Something terrible. When I got to the hospital, I kept a slow pace. The people who passed me by seemed to be staring at me, but never overtly. I tried not to stick out, tried to look like I was moving with purpose. If I didn't look suspicious, why would anyone suspect a thing? The people I passed seemed fooled, but I wasn't sure. I turned to watch them leave. Most of them paid me no mind. I'd only been inside Dr. Young's office once, and it took a bit of searching to remember exactly where it was. The halls weren't too busy, but I still found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. His name on the door identified his office, and I made sure I was alone before peeking through the window. The office was empty. He was probably in his appointment with Florence. I tried the door and was surprised to find it unlocked, and checked once again to ensure the coast was clear before I entered. As far as I could tell, Dr. Young had been there recently. There was a warm cup of coffee on his desk, and his laptop was open. I touched the trackpad and it opened up to the desktop. My hand recoiled as if it had been bitten, but there didn't seem to be anything to worry about. Yet at least, Dr. Young's desktop was messy, and I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I still did look. I didn't know how much time I had. His actual appearances during his appointments with me were usually brief. I had no idea how long he'd be gone, and I didn't want to be caught going through his stuff. I clicked through various documents, none of which were useful to me. I glanced at the door, listening for any trace of movement outside. God, what was I doing? This was insane. I was violating a man's privacy because I thought I'd seen a picture of him with my wife's killer while lurking him on Facebook. That thought was almost enough to make me stop. It almost brought me to my senses. Then I saw something. A file on Florence. I was probably the world's biggest asshole for opening it, but that didn't stop me. I almost felt like my hand was drawn to it. I skimmed most of the file. It was a record regarding her heart condition and her transplant. Most of it was none of my concern, save for one minor note. Donor was a female, 31, who arrived earlier that evening with fatal injuries, identified as Charlotte Harrison. I felt a strange feeling in my stomach. Florence had Charlotte's heart? I read over the file again. Female, 31. Charlotte had been 29 when she died, and as far as I'd known, she had never been an organ donor. Scrolling up in the document again, I noticed something off-kilter as well. Florence had type A blood. Charlotte's had been AB. I remembered Dr. Young telling me that. He said that was why my blood could not have been used to stop Charlotte from bleeding out. My blood was A. And on the night of Charlotte's murder, I had been 31 years old. I read over the words again and again, as if I couldn't fully understand them. The world around me felt hazy, confused. That wasn't Charlotte's heart in Florence's chest. It was a heart belonging to a 31-year-old with type A blood, a person who'd come in at the same time Charlotte had, person like me. There were footsteps outside. I froze and looked up at the door. Then, in a spur of panic, I ducked under the desk. I could hear footsteps on the tile outside drawing closer. I sat there, dead silent as they drew nearer and nearer. Then they passed me by entirely. The footsteps grew quieter as they disappeared down the hall, and I poked my head out from under the desk. I copied the document, closed it out, and left quickly. I wasn't sure what to do or what to think. I felt sick, and I didn't want to believe what was gnawing in the back of my mind, but it was hard to deny it, and even harder to let it sit. I wandered through the hospital in a haze, mindlessly making my way to the front entrance. But as I walked, I felt a slow rage boil within me. More than that, I felt hatred. I remembered the bright light and the visage of Charlotte on the table beside me, dying slowly as the men standing over her took her apart like a machine, systematically removing her organs until the life faded from her eyes. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. At the end of the day, I was waiting. Most people didn't care that I was smoking a cigarette in the parking garage. They paid me no mind, save for the occasional dirty look. But when Dr. Young saw me, I noticed his eyebrow raise ever so slightly. "Tom," he said, "it's a pleasant surprise to see you here. Is it?" I asked. He paused a few steps away from his car as I approached him. "Did you hear that I met someone?" "Oh, well, glad you're moving on, Tom. Yeah, she's really something. We've got a lot in common, including you, it turns out." I saw the smile slowly fading from Dr. Young's face. Come to think of it, it was the first time I saw him that he wasn't smiling. His hands entered his pockets. I won't pretend to understand how this works, but I've started to wonder just how the hell I thought up a character who was almost exactly the same as her. The name, the occupation, even some of her cases. Then I find out we've got the exact same cardiologist, and she just happened to gain a heart on the day I lost one. Funny, right? Just a coincidence. I assure you, Dr. Young said. His hands stayed in his pockets. Really? Because your documents say otherwise. You said it was Charlotte who donated the heart, but that couldn't be it, right? There's no way. She wasn't a match. But me? Wasn't I? Dr. Young just stared at me, silently confirming the truth. "Let me explain something. Okay, Tom? Do me a favor and stay there, document. Do me a favor and stop talking." Dr. Young's voice was as calm as ever, but now I saw the gun in his hands, a small pistol just big enough to fit in his pocket. "I'll admit, I never anticipated you to go snooping through my documents, but I suppose complacency breeds carelessness. That's my fault. You're very lucky I didn't harvest the rest of you, but unfortunately you were still alive. There were others who got involved." "And what about Charlotte?" I asked coldly. "Wasn't she still alive? Your wife?" "I suppose she was. But my nephew was less careless with her. I'll admit, I netted a pretty penny off of her. After you murdered her." Dr. Young didn't do much as flinch. "Jimmy made a mistake. You were both supposed to be dead. Clean shots to the head. That was how it worked. Finishing the job was messy. It's not how I like to do business. But my buyers demand good product, and I couldn't disappoint. So that's why Charlotte had to die?" I asked. "So you could sell her." "Nobody wants to die, Tom. But there's a cost to living. When they're in a shitty situation, some people will do anything. It's hard to come across healthy, matching organs. Sometimes you have to create a supply to feed demand." "What about Florence?" I asked. "Did she pay for my heart?" Dr. Young's smile returned, a little sheepish this time. "Truth be told, that was just unfortunate serendipity. She needed a heart and you were a match. I took a loss on that one, but I more than covered the cost with your wife." His eyes narrowed as he took out his cell phone. The gun in his hand was aimed steadily at my chest. "I suppose in the end you won't be a total loss, though. The rest of you is still in relatively good shape." Perhaps there is something to be said for serendipity after all. Then came the gunshot. Dr. Young's eyes went wide. He fell to his knees before me, and I saw a crimson rose begin to bloom on his stomach. There really is, Florence said coldly. I watched as she emerged from between the cars behind him where she'd been waiting. Dr. Young looked back at her, eyes wide in horror. He opened his mouth, either to scream or to beg. But before he could speak, she put a bullet in his skull. Dr. Young hit the ground, eyes wide and staring up at the ceiling. I watched in silence the whole while. "Did you get it recorded?" she asked. I nodded and took my phone out of my pocket. I handed it off to her. "Good." She looked at the phone in her hand. "I'll make sure this gets to the right people," she said, and looked down at Dr. Young's corpse quietly. We both did. "Thanks," she said after a while, "for telling me. He lied to both of us." I replied, "You deserve to know." In the distance, we could hear people coming. Florence and I stood by the body, waiting for them. I felt her reaching for my hand, and I took it. During his career, Dr. Young had murdered approximately 45 people. It's likely that he killed even more. Their organs had been harvested and sold on the black market. His earnings were squirreled away in an offshore account. Florence claimed that she had come across Dr. Young threatening me after I told her what I'd found. I didn't lie about what I did, and she convinced some of her old police friends to ignore my own minor violations of the law. I was there to testify against the man who killed my wife, and when I did so, I did it with a real heart beating in my chest. See, it turns out that Dr. Young was a match for me, and since he had no further use of it, his heart was mine. As for my heart now belongs to Florence.